Hello everyone, this is part 47 of What If Naruto was in Anbu at 6, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. The chain around her ankle rattled noisily as she paced their little 2-bit shed. Her chakras see off, her stomach rumbling in hunger, and now faced with the dilemma of stop moving or get a headache, made for a very pissed off Sabaku no Temari. She'd gone to rescue the man for God's sake. She wasn't about to him in his damn sleep. When she'd argued that very point with the copycat, the bastard simply shrugged. Can't risk you deciding to come to your senses and getting all patriotic on us, or escaping. He'd added as an afterthought. She truly hated that man. And in typical ninja fashion, they'd been very careful not to leave anything nearby she could use as either a lockpick, or a potential weapon. In other words, she didn't even have the proverbial rubber ball to toss at the wall or something. Her only options were sitting and pacing. And now, because of the noisy chain, one of those was potentially out, leaving her only with the option of sitting as she waited for their charge to wake up, or for Kakashi or Yoshihiro to return from their respective hunting and patrolling, whichever came first. Which was a long time to be spent, doing absolutely nothing either way. They'd found this place almost 2 days ago, an abandoned cottage, peeking out the border of the forests and the northern wastes, almost overgrown with vegetation. The smell of rotting wood and stale air still hung heavy even after almost a full day of being here. Using what little they could find in the place, they'd made Naruto a spot for him to rest, moth-eaten sheets and quilts, bunched up coats and jackets all stuffed together to form a haphazard cot where the godime lay, his eyes closed, as his brow scrunched with the pains of fever. He looked so vulnerable, so weak like this. It was a sight that was both welcoming as it was appalling to her. Welcoming in the sense that she could see he was beatable, capable of falling, of being bested. It somehow brought him down to something she could, not relate to per se, but something she could commune with in a way. Yet, at the same time, it was appalling because of how impossible it was. He was not meant to be like this, wounded and recovering like something mortal, something human. He was supposed to be a monster, a creature of nightmares that would burn anything that stood in his way. It would be so much easier if his image had just stayed that way, wouldn't it? She sighed, laying her head down flat against the creaky, cold floorboards, deciding to get comfortable. Maybe she'd have the luxury of dozing off. The wistful wish apparently came true, because the next thing she knew, she was waking up to the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. She looked around, and to her surprise and horror found that the mop of blonde hair that had been in the other room when she last looked was now a lot closer than before. And in obvious pain. "OS!" she screamed, scrambling up from the floor, only to trip, snagged by the chain at her foot. Not for the first time, she found herself cursing the damn thing and the man who decided to put it on her. She pulled and tugged, hoping the wood, rotting as it was, would give way. Without chakra, however, she had as good a chance at injuring herself as she did of breaking it off the wood. "NRGH," she heard him groan, struggling to move. "Stop," she yelled, thrice times cursing the godforsaken chain and promising to K the copycat when he next got within arm's reach. "You're in no condition," he growled, rolling onto his side, now managing to face her. One eye was shut with pain as the other focused on her. "And just why?" he coughed as he rolled onto his back. "Would that be your concern, Sabaku?" She didn't really know the answer to that, so she chose not to give one. See the macho act, damn it. "I didn't risk my end to rescue you just so you could end up K yourself because of you trying to move too soon." He grunted, apparently too tired to give anything more. "Where are we?" he asked after a short while, apparently having been catching his breath. He must be in worse condition than she'd imagined. "Cabin along the border," she answered shortly. "What do you feel right now?" she asked, giving up on closing the distance between them any further. "At least 2 of my ribs are fractured at the very least, beyond that I cannot tell." Overusing the demon's power, he paused, grunting again as he shifted his position. "Has injured me greatly. Everything hurts." "Scale of 1 to 10. She asked, yanking 2 more times on the chain for good measure. "I took 3 steps, before collapsing." He answered in a tone that easily expressed what he thought of the query. She winced. At a normal ninja's pain tolerance, that would mean their injuries were near crippling. She'd seen this man take enough damage to kill a dozen ninja twice over. Now she knew he was worse off than she'd ever imagined. Look, she said after a pregnant pause. I can't move or I'd help you back to the bed, so just wait there until the old guy and the copycat get back. We must return to Konoha. Your village will survive another day or two without you. She yelled in a tone that reminded him all too much of Hinata on one or two previous occasions when she thought he was overexerting himself. So concerned. Sabaku. She didn't answer, he knew she wouldn't. But he wanted the answer. He wanted to know why she'd done this, risked her life for his. Everything her village now faced could rightfully be set on his existence. If everything would crumble. She must know that, even if she hadn't been conditioned against such psychological syndromes, could not account fully for her actions. He'd shown no intention or hint that he would even consider the notion of negotiation with Suna. Why did you come for me? Sabaku. What does it matter? She yelled, more than a little defensive. You should be grateful. Fraud or lack of it has little consequence. Answer the question. Why did you come for me? She pulled away, remaining quiet as she set her back to the wall, cropping up one knee and resting her hands over it. As she looked to the door, the unspoken statement was clear, she would not answer. At least not yet. He wouldn't push the issue here, he would get the answer he sought when his strength had sufficiently returned and could actually move under his own power. What's more, another was approaching. The sound of footsteps would reach them moments before Kakashi burst into the cabin, nearly knocking down the door in his haste to get in as his eye found Naruto laying on the ground. Dropping the 3 hairs he'd onto the floor in a heap of twisted limbs, and he rushed over, grabbing the Uzumaki by the arm, and lifting his near-dead weight. Why the hell did you try to stand so soon? Naruto didn't answer, merely sighed, the sound emerging with a strangely resigned note to it as Kakashi led him back to the bed. The ropes around her wrist were biting into her skin, scraping and scratching with coarse fibers that bit through her with even the most minor movements. She didn't try to escape, there was no point. She had nowhere else to go and there was no other place where she would be needed more. They were setting up camp now, keeping her away, one guard at her back as she watched them work. Gaara, exhausted, and injured himself, still made an effort to help his remaining Anbu set up the camp. Freeing up some of the others to go off and set a perimeter defense as they'd done night after night they'd traveled through Konoha territory. With any luck, this would be their last night behind enemy lines. 3 days, the cage of Suna still hadn't spoken to her. That would change soon though. She could feel it. She wasn't sure why he'd waited so long, maybe he was still trying to wrap his mind around one surprise too many that he'd barely even given her a second thought. She didn't know, but she knew that today, they would speak. Quietly, she sat at the base of a tree, looking away from the guard at her back, who stood silent and ready. It happened at night, almost midnight judging from the moon and the chill in the air. The guard kicked her awake, rough as he hauled her forward, not saying a word as she offered a brief struggle in her mild disorientation. He shoved her forward, and she had to stop herself from falling on her face before she found her feet again. She looked around, noticing that only her guard, Gaara, and Kankuro were in sight, the others were gone, either patrolling or watching from hidden alcoves, shrouded in shadow. She was pushed down to sit by the fire, the abrupt movement sending a spike of discomfort through her stomach. Her wound from pain still had not healed, she imagined it was the same for Gaara. The Kazekage stared at her, his expression was fierce. As cold as she'd ever seen him. His green eyes glimmering like sharply sea emeralds in the firelight, his hair red. For a striking moment, she could almost see the hair replaced by a hood, and the grim line that was his mouth obscured by a mask. She shivered. She couldn't look at him, couldn't keep staring at the expression that was wrong on his face. She'd seen him angry, she'd seen him stern when he needed to be. Acting as the leader that he was. But, never this. This was something different. She looked away, turning her eyes instead to Kankuro, who lay on a stretcher, and one could see the judgment there already, the resentment carved into the lines of his face, the anger and the suspicion. This she could deal with, because this, she'd been waiting for, expecting it. Well, the older of the siblings shouted, raising himself up on his elbows. You have anything to say for yourself? She licked her dry lips before she shrugged her shoulders. What can I say, Kankuro-san? What can you say? He echoed, the anger in his voice increasing with his disbelief. What can you say? How about an explanation as to why we shouldn't s your tea right now and leave you for the worms? Or how you so conveniently forgot to mention a minute detail about how you share the same bayou as that bastard? That's something you forgot to mention. Did it just slip your mind? She was sure that if his legs still functioned, or if he was in his power suit he would be towering over her right now, maybe he would have even become physically violent. As it was, he looked ready to hurt her if she got within arm's reach. You were probably in on it with that monster all along to drag Suna down into this war. He continued in the face of her silence, his mind having been going to places over the last 3 days. Where the hell were you for those 3 months after the battle at sea? Getting your just rewards down at the Hokage Tower. Huh. She stood, refusing to be kneeling or sitting in the face of this, but the Anbu's harsh hand on her shoulder kept her down as he squeezed his fingers painfully over the pressure points there. I never betrayed you. I've tried to help you. Against Naruto and Zhuge Liang. Oh yay. You got your legs spread for that one too. Kankuro said, now almost fully sitting up as he shouted at her. You got anything to do with how we were so conveniently caught up in that battle when Konoha first invaded Kumo, where I lost my legs? You were there too. I remember. You fought, got yourself into a nice scrap, didn't ya? I don't see you as his prisoner, or missing a limb. I am not a traitor, Kankuro. You've fought him face to face more than anyone. He roared right back. And you always come back, don't you? In one goddamn piece and ready to go at it again. Now we know why. I gotta wonder what he likes more, your spying skills or Kankuro. At Gaara's voice, his brother stopped. His face was still flushed with anger, his breathing heavy as the edge of his teeth could be seen from beneath his curled upper lip grinding together as he made a conscious effort to stop himself from saying anything more. Gaara shifted in his seat, looking to the Anbu behind her. Please, take my brother and leave me for now. The Anbu bowed, and though clearly, the puppet master at his side was displeased with the order, he knew better than to argue now with the Kazekage. Not in front of a prisoner. Because that's what she was now, wasn't she? A prisoner, someone that was suspect, that needed to be interrogated, questioned, untrustworthy, betrayer. That's what she was to them now. The Anbu didn't say a word as he circled around her and walked over to Kankuro before kneeling down and making them both vanish in a puff of grey smoke. Now she was left alone, with nothing but the crackling flames and the Kazekage. She takes a breath and looks at him. When he speaks, his voice is low, almost soft, but there's an edge to it, something dangerous and alien in his voice. Why didn't you tell me? Such a simple question. It should have a simple answer, but it doesn't. There's nothing simple about her life anymore. She wasn't sure if there ever really had been. She looked down, eyes on the patch of grass between his feet. What was I supposed to say, Gaara? Just show up at your doorstep and say, hey, that guy you all think of as a monster only has half the power of his bayou, I have the other half. Don't you dare, he hissed, voice so full of venom she felt herself wince, keep lying to me. I'm a Jinchuriki too, in case you forgot. I've never heard of any bayou being split between two people like yours, but my mother was the medium for Shukaku's transfusion into me, so I know you must share the same bloodline. The only reason I didn't leave you back in the northern wastes was because you clearly stayed there when you could have left and avoided what you knew would come after everything was said and done, but that will only carry my goodwill so far. Her head fell a little more. The shame she knew she should not feel crawled up her insides, beyond her control. So he knew then. You were going to tell me, or I swear I will. He's my brother. She see him off, stopping the words that would have been released in anger. Words that shouldn't belong to him. It was a different face, a different person who would say such things so callously. It wasn't Gaara. It shouldn't be Gaara. She didn't need to look at his face to see his surprise. In the silence that followed, it was almost too apparent. He'd expected something, no doubt, a distant relative, cousin, uncle or something of that nature. Nothing that should have been so close. Your brother. She nodded, though she knew it wasn't necessary. For a long while, he sat still, his thoughts a mystery to her, then, without warning he stood, marching over to one of the tents she assumed was his and returning moments later with 3 items that he tossed at her feet. He drew a kunai knife, circling her before see her ropes apart. Surprised and confused, she didn't get a chance to say anything before he himself spoke. Pick it up and leave. What? He walked over to his previous seat, setting himself down before he glared at her, his green eyes as sharp and unyielding as rocks. You kept this a secret from us for almost an entire year. No one, not even Daisuke, suspected anything like this. If you can hide that, then God knows what else you can hide. I need people I can trust. And that's obviously not you. He looked down, his shoulders slouched. Apparently there's very few people I can trust, it seems. She had no doubt he was referring to Zhu Liang. Seeing his sister must have brought suspicious thoughts to the surface, most of which would point to only one man who had the power, the intelligence, skill and influence to keep such knowledge from them. Gaara, please. Leave. Akina. There's not enough for me to say you betrayed us, but you're not coming with us either. When I return to Suna, my Anbu captains will know well enough to KU on sight, no questions asked. Just your captains, she echoed, smiling sadly. I suppose the people of Suna still need the hope of their angel, huh? He didn't answer, there was no need. She was right, she knew it, and he knew she knew it. She knelt down, picking up the worn cloak, sheet, and kunai pouch he'd thrown there. Placing the cloak on her back, the knives on her belt and the sheet under her arm, she fought the tears along the edges of her eyes as she faced him. Bowing at the waist, neither said anything more as she turned and walked away from the campsite. Kakashi's face was grim, the mask couldn't hide that. The tomo spun in his eyes slowly, almost hypnotically. The man finally sighed, pulling down his forehead protector to cover his Sharingan again. Look Naruto, I'm no Hyuga, this is hardly going to be. What did you see, Kakashi? The blonde interrupted softly, eyes closed, giving no indication to his discomfort. Naruto, you really should tell me. The copycat's lips curled beneath his mask in a grimace, taking a quick look behind him where Yoshihiro cooked the rabbit stew and Temari still lay miserably in the corner, chained once again after being allowed out to stretch her legs for a few hours. He made sure they weren't really listening in the confined space before he turned back to Naruto and spoke up again. Well, from what I can see, and I repeat I could be completely wrong about thee. I have the utmost faith in your competence. Naruto responded dryly, growing tired of Kakashi's hesitation. Now speak plainly. A sigh through his nostrils. Your chakra coils were severely damaged. The demon's chakra is still running through your system, which is partially why you haven't recovered completely yet. At this point it seems to be doing as much damage as it's repairing. Naruto sighed, but otherwise gave no other reaction. What a blunder, he thought. Chakra poisoning. Careless, too careless. Naruto. Kakashi's voice brought him out of his thoughts. I'm no expert, but, if you ever push yourself like that again then. I am aware of my limitations, Kakashi. Are you? He snapped harshly before he could stop himself. Naruto looked to him, his eyes neutral. Your concern is noted, Hatake, but unnecessary. In 2 days, I should be sufficiently recovered to make the journey back to Konoha. Don't push yourself, Naruto. Before you were the cage, you were my subordinate. I don't want to see you hurt yourself from foolish pride or arrogance. Never had Kakashi brought up their once upon a time status of Junin and student, or more precisely, mission commander and subordinate in the chain of command. It brought back memories not entirely unpleasant and an odd desire for such a time to return. For the days when things were simple, when Sarutobi still lived and he was not the head of what was fast becoming an empire, where he did not hold the weight of the world bearing down on his shoulders as he carried it to its inevitable fate. And Naruto suddenly found himself feeling weary, a deep, bone-tired feeling that made his shoulders sag and his sea tighten. That will be all, Kakashi. With a nod after a brief moment's hesitation, Kakashi stood, offering an assurance that he would bring some food for him when it was done before he turned around, and walked into the other room, sitting across from Yoshihiro by the fire. Closing his eyes, the Demon King allowed himself to fall into a fitful sleep. The clothes Kakashi and Yoshihiro had found in this shed barely fit him, and the tatters they have become through what may very well have been decades of rats and moths chewing over their fabrics can scarcely be said to keep the chill from his skin at all. But he doesn't complain, merely puts them on and uses whatever of cloths are left to wrap his hands and shins. The only thing that rightly remains of his old clothing that isn't drenched in beer, his boots, a fact that he is thankful for as he tightens their straps. He is used to such hardships, he will make do and he will survive it easily, but even he must admit that after so many years behind the fine fabrics of the Hokage and customized equipment and clothing outfitted for combat, to be dressed in such tatters made him feel very strange. Almost, dare he say, out of place. He'll have to steal some clothes from a town or a traveling trader if the opportunity arises between here and Konoha. Though he had little personal qualms about such things, the last thing Konoha's populace needed to see was their leader returning looking like some vagabond beggar. He pushed the thought out of his mind, however, using the last S of cloth to tie back his wild blonde hair that had grown just shy of his shoulders after so long away. He channeled his chakra through his hands, making sure not to force too much as he ignored the slight discomfort in both the limb and his rolling stomach as he moved the energies within his body. Passing the hand over his face, hundreds of tiny blades sear away at the stubble that had been growing over his chin and jaw. Not a perfect job, but it would do. Emerging from the back room, he found Kakashi and Yoshihiro gathering their equipment. Temari still sat at the corner, angry that she was still tied to the damn floorboard with that chain. Go. I will finish here. Gather the traps you've deployed. We might need the tools later. Without another word, Kakashi and Yoshihiro stood, with the older male taking his hammer before he left the shed to the outside world. The morning dew sweeping in across the floor for a brief moment as the door opened and was firmly shut behind them. Naruto knelt down, picking up what little equipment was in the shed, taking longer than necessary on purpose. It was time to get the answer he wished. More seconds passed in silence and he could feel her irritation mounting. It didn't take much longer. You ever plan on letting me out of this chain? She bit out, almost snarling at him. That, he responded, is entirely up to you right now, Sabaku. Meaning, he straightened his shoulders, elbows resting on bent knees as he looked at her. I asked you 2 days ago when I first woke to tell me why you'd come to help me. I'm still waiting for that answer. She balked. So you're saying you're just gonna leave me tied here by my ankle if I don't answer your stupid question? If the question is as stupid as you say it is, then the answer is obvious and irrelevant, and so should be easy for you to give voice. He countered calmly. She grit her teeth, her mind fumbling for anything, that she could say to this. How the hell was she supposed to answer a question she hadn't fully figured out herself? What does it matter? I saved you, so you owe me. At least enough to not have me tied by the ankle like some dog you need to keep on a leash. Ah, he said, clarifying to himself. So you did it in the hope that I'd grant you a boon of sorts. To spare your village or family, no doubt. A part of her said to leave it at that, to let him assume he was right and just let it drop there. But another part of her, the bigger part, the part that had driven her to help in the first place, twisted her see in an odd manner. She could someone relate it to guilt, or pity. It was possibly some odd combination of both. That's not the real reason. Her mouth formed the words before her brain could catch up. At least, that's probably one of the last things I'd thought of when I made the offer to Kakashi and Yoshihiro to tag along. He didn't say anything, merely looked at her, and she knew she was expected to continue. Temari was a proud woman, and one of the things she valued most was the fact that she could tell you anything with a straight face, even tone, and a statement that was as blunt as the flat head of a hammer. She decided this would be no different. Sitting up a little straighter, she looked at the Demon King in the eyes. She spoke, her voice calm and measured. When I saw you, fighting in Wave, she paused, only for a moment wondering if she'd make him angry with her next words. All I could feel was pity. He gave no reaction, merely continued to stare. So, she continued to speak. I felt pity because, you were standing there, fighting off 4 of the most powerful shinobi any of us had ever seen. And you were just, so alone. She made a vague gesture with her hand, averting her eyes as she seemed to search for the words. I don't just mean physically, I mean, you walked out of that pier and just fought. You seemed so, accustomed, to just being alone that even when you needed help the most you didn't ask for it, you didn't even see if anyone else could help. She stood, impulse driving her as she started to pace. You've been leading all of these people who look to you and rely on you. Your entire country seems to just be leaning on you. Like you're the pillar that single-handedly holds it up and there was no one there for you to just. I just don't know how you could do it. How Yugara was born a Jinchuriki, and if he didn't have me or Kanku. She stopped, catching herself too late as she realized she'd revealed more than she felt comfortable with. Though he said nothing, in his mind the Jinchuriki felt the beginnings of comprehension. Projecting her brother and myself in the same light. It was strange, he would conclude later, that she should do that. Sabaku no Gaara, from what little he had seen of the Jinchuriki's rational controlled state, during the battle at sea, and from what he'd heard from Kakashi's report over the taking of Kumo, was so immensely different that the Godime could almost compare it to a coin head. Gaara was an amateur at hiding his emotions. When they'd been standing on the decks of those ships, side by side, he'd seen the Kazekige's worry and anxiety over his sister's safety as clear as day. And from what Kakashi had told him, Gaara had led the charge into Kumo's valuable soldiers and resources to buy time for the refugees to flee down to the docks where they could escape. Foolish. If it had been him, he'd have bombed the village from the port with ship cannons. They would certainly take a heavy toll on the invading Konoha army. Not enough to repel them perhaps, but certainly taking down more than the paltry number they had killed during that assault. Burn them all. The refugees would be useless to him. Too few remained to be made into an effective militia and would only serve as extra rations to be given out from Suna's stores, which was already a limited supply given the fact that their main trade was by sea with Kumo and Kiri, and land lines that went to Bird and River country, one of which had been declaring neutrality up and down since he'd launched his campaign against Sakai. That left them with only one real supplier with enough quanis of grain to provide for the army Suna no doubt had ready at its disposal. A supply line he would see at the route, when he returned to Konoha. Overall, to Naruto, Gaara was a fool. An idealistically naive leader who had not yet learned that the ninja world demanded to be made for the survival of the greater good. A weak, naive, fool. Temari's comparison of the two of them was a notion of irrationality that he could barely comprehend. So he chose not to even try. He finished packing the equipment, sealing the satchel bag before he stood and walked to where Temari was still chained. Placing his hand over the lock at his ankle, he pushed the sluggish chakra through his fingertips. With a click, the lock was undone and Temari gratefully pulled the metal off her as she rubbed her sore ankle. I never thought I'd hear music in the sound of an opening lock. Naruto shrugged his shoulders and stood. Suna glowed like a diamond amidst a sea of purple ink that was the sand cast under the pale light of the moon, to the travel-weary band that made their way over the dunes that rose and dipped like the great waves of an ocean, the billowing winds carrying the scent of cinnamon, nutmeg and tea to their senses, and the only thought that could really cross their minds as their eyes found the city was home. Gaara, however, held an entirely different emotion altogether. For nearly a week, his carefully held emotions had been boiling beneath the surface, setting his mind ablaze and that hateful, spindly tinge of anger to simmering just beneath his skin. He expected no respite and no relief here. He'd been lied to, manipulated, and had his country dragged down into a war that had cost them more lives than he cared to fathom. A war that could have been possibly avoided. No, the Kazekige would not rest, not until he'd been satisfied. And he was out for a dragon's bee. Ying could hear him coming now. Her informant was good. He told her of his approach almost as soon as the scouts were shouting it at the village gates. He was angry too, she could tell that much. The shouts he gave to the Anbu who guarded his estate through the walls as though they were paper thin, demanding to know where Zhuliang was and leaving before they could get a word in edgewise. Good. He walks in angry, unprepared. She caught her train of thought, smiling a bitter smile to herself. Though he was gone, he held her, dancing to the tune and rhythm of his choice. She was thinking as he would, preparing herself as he would. Even playing the tune for others to dance, as he would. You stupid, infuriating man. She thought, wiping a stray tear from her eye as she composed herself, taking a breath as she heard the footsteps drawing closer, and closer. The door was flung open, crashing against the wall with a deafening bang that had her jump slightly, despite herself. Where is he? Gaara's face was a whitewash of fury. He was ready for a fight, she could see. Ready to shout, accuse, even ready for outright physical violence against the man who called himself the Sleeping Dragon. What he was not ready for, was for her to hold out her hand, opening it to reveal the glinting steel of a Kumo Hittite. My husband, is D. Kazekige Sama. The rain was harsh, biting, and the talons of its cold chill sank deep into her as she hugged the soaked cloak closer to herself. The moon was covered by the clouds, making it too dark to see. The hiss of the rain was an overture, blinding her sense of smell and hearing. She was blind and deaf out here, and that, she found even more terrifying than the thought of any potential sickness this could bring. There was no shelter, anywhere. Gaara had only given her knives, a cloak and some cloth. She had no rope to make a proper shelter with, and none of the bark of this area could work to make it, none of the wood was dry enough to make a fire either. So here she was, wet, cold, blind, exhausted, and for all intents and purposes, deaf, marching through the wetlands west of Fire Country as she sought to put as much distance between herself and Konoha-controlled territory as she could. Which is why she never sensed her attacker until he was almost on top of her. He struck from above, and only the distinct flap of a cloak caught in the wind gave her enough warning to dodge as she ducked the blow that would have struck her head. She turned, the rain was disorienting, the darkness was like a veil over her eyes, barely allowing her the sight of his silhouette. She leaned back, stepping away, trying to get some distance as she caught the glint of a kunai and felt its razor-sharp point rush past her face. Fast, she dug into her own pouch, pulling out one of her knives to defend herself as she tried to think who this could be. Sooner, Konoha. How would either one know where to find her? Who did they have this good to spare? As she pulled the blade free, her attacker's fist lashed out, fast as lightning, hitting her forearm with strength that sent stars to dance in front of her eyes as she felt her arm break. She dropped the knife in reflex, not even having the time to scream as his foot into her, knocking the breath from her lungs as she fell to the wet floor. The next thing she knew, the kunai blade was at her teeth and her attacker's mirthful voice was pushing its way to her mind through the constant hiss of the rain. Those red eyes are real interesting there, girl. Gaara's fierce expression fell for a split second, revealing as clear as day his shock at what he'd just been told before the fury returned, as strong as it had been before. Do not play games with me, Yue Ying. He hissed. I am well past believing anything you or Zhu Liang have to say. His body is in the mortuary. She interrupted, looking into his eyes. I did not think you would demand proof, but I suppose I thought ahead in that as well. You may have any medic of your choosing examine him to confirm. This time, the silence between them was longer, and Gaara was clearly only just beginning to believe the barest possibility of what she was telling him. You are suspicious of us now, she stated, thinking out loud. You've discovered something. It hardly matters, he growled, his teeth bared, the animal within him clawing at the surface of his mind in his anger. If he's who did he leave in charge then? You, Sunad. You intend to lash out, she noted, observing him, actions and mannerisms as carefully as she could, deducing his every thought as he formed it. You would have all that remains of Zhu Liang's subjects pay for whatever crime my husband has inflicted upon you. She looked past him, to the door. And Yugito? He didn't answer, merely continued to glare. And that was answer enough for both questions. She choked down her grief, smothering it before it could form. There would be time for pain later. There was always time for pain. From the folds of her robe she pulled out a scroll, lined with gold etchings that framed the white center, bearing the symbol of the Kumo village. She walked forward, beginning to close the distance between them. I'm afraid, if your heart is so filled with anger that you'd carry out such an intent, Kazekage-sama, then you will perhaps find it more difficult than you may have anticipated. He eyed the scroll in her hand, and she could almost see the barest hint of knowing there, scratching at him, like an insistent child that wanted acknowledgement. A child that was coming closer and closer to getting it with every step she took. When she was within arm's reach, slowly, carefully, she reached for his hand, pulling it forward by the wrist as she placed the scroll in his firm grasp. This is what he'd wanted. What he'd asked of her. All those who could have stood in the way, silenced. All the pieces arranged as best she could. Now it was time to place the final piece, the most important, where it needed to be, and for all that remained of the world to enact its final gambit. He'd wanted this, and she'd seen it done. Because the person my husband entrusted to lead what's left of his people, is you. Suzume gnawed on her lower lip, looking over the supply request for what must have been the 10th time, mulling it over in her mind. One would think that after almost a month and a half she'd be somewhat used to these kinds of decisions. She wasn't. The fact was, that their supplies were stretched thin, and everybody needed more. The supplies the men from Iwa had requested were currently in reserve, but in the central marshlands of Taki and Kusa it was monsoon season. Waters came down harsh for almost 2 months straight, so rivers ran high, flooding everything. And though they had their own stocks and keeps, Mother Nature could be a harsh mistress, and these specific supplies the Iwa garrison were requesting were their plan B. If she didn't send them, the Iwa garrison may find itself in dire straits, and any remaining rebellious factions in Iwa, the most unstable of territories they currently held, could choose to capitalize on that, which could prove to be more than a major setback with war already waging. And then, if she did send it, and the flooding caused enough damage to Kusa and Taki's own lifelines, then they'd have nothing to fall back on. The troops she'd have to send to quell food riots alone would leave their as of yet still regrouping front lines dangerously thin. How on earth had Naruto dealt with this for years? And she wasn't even giving troop movement orders and dealing with all the ramifications that went into that. Naruto. The name alone sent pangs of worry through her. Jiraiya and Hinata had been brought here little more than a week ago, and it did not take long for the news to reach her ears after that. Naruto had been captured. She'd scrambled all the ninja she had at her disposal, which were not many, with the bulk of their elites either returning from Kumo or still gathered at the borderlands between Suna and Konoha. She'd hoped that she'd get back some word from at least one of them. She hadn't heard anything, except a few vague rumors, all of which pointed them to the northern wastes. Within the first 2 days, the Anbu guard that remained at the tower had advised her to call them back, and to send a carrier pigeon to the Iwa garrison, who held a fair decent number of Junin and a handful of Anbu as the core force, to set up a proper team to go search. She was worried. Most wouldn't know why. She couldn't really say she was his friend in all certainty. They'd never been close, never even chatted after office hours. Maybe, at best, he considered her a slightly closer than normal borderline acquaintance going on friend status of some kind, and even that may be presuming too much. But, to her, regardless of whatever he might have considered her, she did consider him her friend. Albeit, a very distant and scary friend, but a friend nevertheless. So in short, she was worried about him personally, more than many of the other Junins and ninja she'd caught gossiping, wondering what would happen without the Demon King. She remembered once overhearing a ninja asking Jiraiya if they should have a contingency plan in case Naruto's. And Jiraiya had answered, in a tone so certain that, at the time she, and most likely the ninja as well, had believed his words as though they were an immutable fact of life. The world itself will probably break before he does. You don't need to worry. Time had changed, at least, her views. Maybe it was because she spent more time with him on the day-to-day, actually saw him, had actual conversations with him, that she wasn't caught like everyone else in the myth and hyperbole of the Demon King, who could fell entire armies, who couldn't be killed by mortal hands. He must seem like such a distant and untouchable figure to most others. She just saw a man. It allowed her to actually worry about the man behind the myth. The one made of F and B that carried the weight of the world on him. She sighed, leaning back against the chair, choosing to ignore how late it was for the time being. He'll be fine, and you need to get this stuff done so there's no overflow for him to deal with when he gets back. Now she just had to decide what to do with the supplies. She was so focused on her decision that when the door to what was for the moment her office was thrown open, she jumped, her heart leaping into her tea and clogging her voice box. And there stood the object of what she'd been worried over no more than 2 seconds ago, dressed in a thick brown traveler's cloak and mud-stained clothing, soaked from head to toe from the drizzle that peppered the village and surrounding forests, stood Naruto Uzumaki, eyes sweeping over the office for only a moment before settling on her and nodding. Hokage-sama, she breathed, more surprised by the lack of warning than the fact that he was actually here. In response, he simply nodded. Suzume, he greeted. And that was about as much of a shock recovery period as he would allow. I am going to my home to clean myself. By the time I return, I want a summary report of all that has transpired since Kumo was taken. I also want the lead captain of the Anbu and Jiraiya, if he is in the village, to be brought to my office. If he is not, then I want a message to be sent for him to return. I need reports on troop movements, both friendly and hostile, printed out and on my desk within the hour. Without another word, he turned and began marching down the hallway, trusting her to do what he'd asked. Suzume forced her heart back down her tea, sputtering for anything to say before she shouted. Wait, Hokage-sama. He stopped, looking over his shoulder, waiting for her to continue. And for a second, her thoughts fled, and all the things she wanted to say or ask went with it, and instead, she found herself saying the most pressing thing that she knew would be to his concern. Hokage-sama, it's about Hinata-sama, sir. Akina could feel the rain beating against her head and cheeks, and she struggled to look clearly into the eyes of her attacker through the droplets of water. She knew better than to struggle, though she had a much better chance of surviving than almost anyone else. She didn't want to risk it. The jugular pumped out enough B to make an individual blackout from B loss in less than 10 seconds. And she doubted she could focus the QB's chakra to even begin healing her before she blacked out, let alone retaining enough consciousness or mobility to fight back. The veil of clouds overhead was pulled away, allowing the pale light to wash down over them, pushing back the darkness that had kept her all but blind. She recognized this man now. The hood over his head had obscured his features, but in the light, anyone in the world would recognize him. It was impossible not to. Sharp pointed teeth stared right back at her, revealed in the wide smile of her attacker. Hoshigek Kisum. His smile got a little wider, the kunai pressed a little harder. Guilty as charged. He chuckled. Now, why don't you tell me a little more about the chakra you're ready to pull out, little girl? She felt a pit form in her stomach at the glint in his eye that held a darkness that was all too familiar to her as he added just a little more pressure to that knife. I bet there's an interesting story behind that one isn't there. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.